She was fired for fixing a kid's broken bike right there, beside the school fence, in front of a crowd that clapped for her and a principal who didn't. "It's not your job," they said. "It's not protocol." But the kid cried harder than she did, and just when it felt like silence would be the only thing knocking at her door, her phone rang. There were 17 strangers outside, all wearing suits. "If you believe that doing the right thing should never cost you everything, stick with us. And if this story stays with you, consider liking, sharing, or leaving a thought. We're listening." The late afternoon light stretched long across the cracked concrete of Fulton Springs Elementary. The playground was almost empty now. Most kids had gone home. The buses had rolled out. The echo of laughter had faded, leaving behind the quiet hum of traffic on the far end of Ridge Avenue. But in one corner, near the fence that backed up to the alley, Nora Callahan knelt beside a red bicycle, her knees pressed against the cold ground, denim scraped, hands deep in chain grease. She worked in silence, jaw tight, sleeves pushed to her elbows. The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of rust and dry leaves. Beside her stood Tyler Jenkins, 8 years old, thin, clutching his backpack like it was the last safe thing in the world. He shifted from foot to foot, glancing at the sky. "I need to make the 5:20 bus," he said. "My grandma's waiting." Nora didn't answer at first. Her brow furrowed as she tested the tension of the new link she'd just added. Then, without looking up, she replied, "You will. Just give me one more minute." Tyler's bike had a busted chain and one bent. Spoke. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. And Nora, substitute teacher, widow, mother, and sometimes, to kids like Tyler, a stand-in for whatever safety they'd lost, had promised him she'd take care of it. He had mentioned, just once, weeks ago, that his dad currently deployed in Djibouti used to fix his bike. Then he went quiet. That was enough. She gave the pedal a spin. The chain caught. It held. She exhaled softly. There we go. That was when the footsteps clicked in. Principal Glazer's voice cut across the playground like a cold wind. "Ms. Callahan, what exactly do you think you're doing?" Nora stood slowly. She wiped her hands on a rag she kept in her coat pocket. Glazer approached with brisk, clipped steps. A younger teacher trailed behind, holding a phone, already filming. "Are you authorized to perform mechanical work on school grounds?" Glazer's voice had that crisp edge, the kind that didn't want answers, only control. "Because this is a liability. We have procedures for a reason." Nora didn't answer. She turned to Tyler and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Go on," she said. "You'll make it in time." He hesitated, looked between the two women, then mounted the bike and rode off toward the bus lane, wheels squeaking, backpack bouncing behind him. Glazer didn't wait. "You're dismissed for the day. HR will follow up. You are not to return until further notice." The younger teacher flinched, Nora noticed, but said nothing. She picked up her bag, slinged it over her shoulder. The rag was still in her hand, stained with oil and a bit of dust. She didn't apologize, didn't defend herself. She simply walked past the two women toward the parking lot. The camera kept recording until she turned the corner and disappeared. That night, the video made its way onto a local Facebook group for parents. It was shared with a caption that read, "This teacher fixed a student's bike and got fired for it." Within hours, it spread from Pittsburgh to Erie, then to community blogs, then to national headlines. A teacher kneeling by a child's bike, a stern principal in a wool coat. A quiet act turned public controversy. Some comments were outraged, others were cautious, but the image stuck. A woman helping, a child trusting, a system interrupting. And in a penthouse office in downtown Philadelphia, a man named Emmett Carrington watched the clip 5 times, then once more. He didn't blink much, didn't speak. But when he reached for his phone, his hand moved without hesitation. She hadn't said a word in the video, but somehow she'd spoken to him. The light in Nora's apartment was always a little too dim. One overhead bulb hung in the corner, humming faintly, casting a soft yellow wash across the counter and the small table wedged next to the window. The linoleum curled near the fridge. The heater clicked, but never quite warmed the floor. It was quiet, except for the soft scrape of her spoon against the inside of a chipped mug. She sat in her usual spot, worn flannel shirt, hair still damp from a rushed shower, and stared at the cracked screen of her phone. A dozen text messages from parents, a few unread emails from substitute teacher portals, and one headline that hadn't left the top of her notifications: teacher fired for fixing student's bike. Her name wasn't in the title, but it didn't need to be. She was the woman in the video, the one kneeling beside the child, the one who didn't speak, who didn't plead, who just let the moment pass, as if she expected it to. Nora placed the phone down carefully, then reached for the calendar pinned on the wall with a magnet. 3 red slashes already marked this week rent due, groceries running out, tutoring session canceled. The last one hit harder than the rest. She had counted on that check to cover utilities. She wasn't angry. Not really. She was used to systems breaking. It was the silence afterward that stung the space where someone could have asked, "Why did you do it?" and instead chose not to ask anything at all. Across the state, 42 stories above the glass and steel of Midtown Manhattan, Emmett Carrington leaned against the edge of his desk. The video played again on his monitor. No sound, just the movement. A woman fixing a bike, a boy watching her. The stern figure of the principal stepping in. The quiet resignation of someone who had learned, somewhere along the way, not to expect fairness. Emmett didn't blink much. His hands were folded, his face unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who reacted visibly, but something inside him tugged, gently at first, then with more insistence. He paused the clip on a frame where Nora looked up. Her face wasn't panicked. It wasn't angry. It was still, grounded, as if she'd already calculated what this would cost her, and still did it anyway. He'd seen that look before. He remembered it from a cold night outside the halfway shelter in Trenton when he was 10. Shoes with holes, frozen fingers, and a woman in a coat too big for her who bent down to patch the sole of his sneaker with duct tape and said, "Some things are worth fixing, even if they break again." He never saw her again, but he never forgot. Emmett sat down. The leather of his chair creaked softly. He reached for the drawer to his left and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed at the corners. Inside was a note, nearly 20 years old. The handwriting was loopy, a little smudged, the same message he had read 100 times before one day. "You'll be able to help someone else. When that day comes, do it without needing a reason." He turned toward the window. The skyline stretched wide, glittering, indifferent. He could hear the faint hum of conference calls down the hall, the soft ding of elevator doors. But none of it felt pressing now. He picked up his phone. "Cassidy," he said when his assistant answered. "I need you to find someone for me." There was a pause on the other end. "Her name's Nora Callahan, Pittsburgh area. She's in a video that's making rounds. Fired for fixing a bike. I want to know everything: who she is, where she lives, what she does." Another pause. "Also, call the Pay It Forward Fund. Tell them I'm activating Group 17. Cassidy hesitated. "All 17 of them. Yes, every last one. Tell them I said it's time." He ended the call, then leaned back in his chair. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. Somewhere in the distance, in the life of a woman who had likely already packed away her tools and tried to move on, a shift had started. She didn't know it yet, but she would. He stood and walked to the window, phone still in hand. The city lights blurred a little through the glass, as if the world itself was trying to see clearer. She hadn't looked back in the video. She hadn't explained herself. But somehow, she'd said everything that mattered. The morning air pressed heavy through the cracked window above Nora's sink. She was rinsing out the last of her coffee, her fingers moving on instinct. The mug had a chip near the rim, the handle warmed from years of holding on. In the background, the local news murmured about weather and rising rents. She barely listened. Her mind had already moved ahead, to the bus ride downtown, to the list of stores she planned to visit asking for part-time work. She'd printed out 5 resumes, nothing fancy, just a plain typeface, and her name bolded at the top, next to a phone number that sometimes missed calls. She pulled her coat from the hook near the door, slipped it on, then paused at the mirror. There were streaks from where the glass had cracked diagonally across the bottom. She adjusted her collar, smoothed her hair, and whispered, "One block at a time." The knock came just as she reached for the knob. It was sharp, confident, not rushed. She hesitated, then opened the door. 17 men stood in a semicircle on her porch and the walkway beyond. Some wore tailored jackets, crisp shirts. Others were in flannel jeans, boots worn from use. They didn't speak right away. They just looked at her, as if searching for something they thought they'd find. Emmett Carrington stood in the middle. He wore no tie. His coat was open, hands in his pockets. But there was still something unmistakably precise about the way he stood, the quiet command in his eyes. He stepped forward. "Ms. Callahan," he said, "we're not here to hire you. We're here to thank you." She blinked. "You've got the wrong address. You're Nora Callahan, Fulton Springs Elementary, the woman who fixed a boy's bike and lost her job for it." A pause. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. "And you are?" "We're part of something called the Pay It Forward Fund," Emmett said. "All of us, at one time or another, were kids who needed someone. We had someone. And now, when we see someone like you, someone who steps in without asking if it's allowed, we show up." Nora frowned. "You show up and do what, make a video, offer a check, and call it charity?" Emmett didn't smile. "No, we listen. Then we ask what you need." The man standing just behind him, older, African-American, leaned in slightly. "You see that bike out there?" he said, pointing to the one leaning against the fence. "When I was 9, I rode a bike just like that to the food pantry every Thursday, rain or shine. That bike meant survival." Nora looked at him, then at the others. There were scars on some of their faces, tension in the way they stood. These weren't strangers off the street. They were people who understood what it meant to make do, to wait, to hope small. Still, she kept her voice steady. "I don't need a spotlight, and I sure don't need pity." "We're not offering either," Emmett said. "We're offering ground." He reached into his coat pocket and placed a thick envelope on the table just inside the door. "No strings. It's a seed. If you want to walk away, we won't follow. But if you've ever dreamed of building something better, you won't be alone." She didn't move. Her eyes lingered on the envelope, then on the man who had just placed it there like it meant nothing, though everything about him suggested otherwise. Her heart was a slow drumbeat in her chest. She wasn't someone who trusted easily, not since the years of raising a daughter alone, working 3 jobs, fighting school bureaucracy that saw her as disposable. "I don't have time for grand offers," she said. "We're not here to impress," Emmett replied. "We're here because someone like you kept a promise to a child, and we remember what that feels like." Nora's voice softened, almost inaudible. "Sometimes, promises are all you have." Emmett nodded once. "That's why they matter." Outside. A car passed slowly. One of the men took a step back, sensing the edge of the moment. They weren't pushing. They had said their piece. Nora stepped halfway into the doorway. She didn't open the envelope. She didn't ask for details, but she didn't close the door either. Cliffhanger hung in the air like a question unspoken. The envelope rested on the edge of the table, untouched, yet impossible to ignore. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. And the porch stayed quiet, like everyone was waiting to see what kind of morning this might become. The cafe wasn't remarkable, one of those narrow corner spots near Pittsburgh's Union Station, where the smell of burnt espresso clung to the air and every surface seemed to hold someone's past conversation. It was half empty, dimly lit, with chipped black and white tiles and a radio playing soft jazz above the sound of the milk steamer. Nora sat by the window, hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold, watching the late afternoon traffic move like slow blood through the veins of downtown. Emmett sat across from her, no assistant, no entourage, just him, a plain dark coat, sleeves rolled once at the wrist, and a paper cup he hadn't touched. He'd insisted on meeting her here neutral ground. He said, She hadn't answered when he texted. She almost didn't show up. But now that she had, she stayed silent, letting him begin on his own terms. He didn't rush. "I grew up about 6 stops from here," he said, finally, eyes on the steam dancing above her mug. "Single mom, 3 jobs. You know the story." She nodded once, barely. "There were winters when we'd tape cardboard to the windows to keep the cold out." He continued, "I used to walk to school in shoes with split soles. One night, a woman handed me her gloves at a bus stop, said I looked like I was freezing. I was..." She didn't ask questions, just slipped them into my hands and left. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded scrap of paper, edges frayed. He passed it to her without speaking. She opened it slowly. The writing was faded, but still legible. "You matter. Pass it on someday." Nora's fingers held the note like it might tear if she breathed too hard. "She never told me her name," Emmett said, "but I've carried that with me since I was 10. I used it as a bookmark, then just kept it in my wallet. Reminded me there were people who did good without needing permission." Nora looked up. Her voice was low. "That's why you came to my door." He nodded. "That's part of it." She studied him. "And the other part," he shifted. A beat passed. Then he spoke with a weight she hadn't heard from him before. "I was at Fulton Springs the day you were fired. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the playground. I was upstairs in a meeting district finance review." Something moved in her eyes. "I'm the one who signed off on the budget cuts," he said quietly. "Your position was on the list. Temporary roles. First to go." Nora's breath caught. Her face didn't twist or break. She just looked at him like someone staring through glass they didn't know was there until it cracked. "So," she said, voice flat, "you fired me twice. Once on paper, once in public." He didn't defend himself. He didn't offer a version of events that might soften the blow. "I didn't know your name back then." He said, "But when I saw the video, when I saw your face, I recognized the kind of person you were, and I couldn't pretend anymore that kindness was someone else's job." She leaned back, crossing her arms. "You've got a lot of nice words. I've got more than that," he said, "but I know words aren't what you need." Silence spread between them. The cafe buzzed faintly with background noise, but neither of them moved. Then Nora reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and opened a side pocket. Inside was a folded note from her daughter, written in crayon. "Mom never quits, even when she should." She didn't hand it over, just looked at it, then tucked it back without comment. "You don't know me," she said. "I'd like to." He replied. "I don't want someone to lead me," she added. Sharper now. "I've walked too far on my own to follow anyone." Emmett nodded slowly. "Then I'll walk beside you. If you'll let me." She didn't smile, didn't soften, but she didn't get up either. Cliffhanger lingered as she glanced out the window again, her reflection barely visible in the glass. She said nothing more. And yet, when he rose from the table and turned toward the door, he heard the scrape of her chair against tile behind him. She didn't look back, but he knew something had shifted. It was barely past 8 when Nora stepped into the Hill District Community Library, holding her daughter's hand and a folder of lesson plans under her arm. The morning sun filtered weakly through the tall windows, making streaks across the worn carpet. The front desk smelled of old books and lemon cleaner. A volunteer nodded as she passed. There wasn't much bustle this early, just a few students lingering over borrowed laptops and a janitor wiping the fingerprints off the glass door. Emmett trailed a few steps behind, hands in his coat pockets, saying nothing. He didn't belong here, not in the way Nora did. She belonged in quiet places with scuffed furniture and stories stuck to the walls. She moved like someone who had learned to carry herself without noise. When they reached the second floor, she knelt beside a small boy seated near the reading corner. His shoelace had come undone, dragging like a tail as he walked. She didn't ask questions, just reached down and tied it again, double knotting it with practiced ease. "You always do that?" Emmett asked. "Do what's step in for every kid who needs something." She straightened, eyes on the bulletin board where class schedules were pinned in crooked rows. I just do what's necessary. No one called attention to her, but there was a subtle shift when she entered a room, a kind of quiet respect, the kind earned by showing up, over and over, when no one else did. Later, during a workshop for early readers, the projector stopped working. The screen went blank. Volunteers fumbled with remotes, tapping buttons and exchanging helpless looks. Without a word, Emmett stepped forward, crouched beside the equipment table, opened the casing with the edge of a library card, and pulled a frayed wire loose. Spent a year fixing stuff like this, he murmured. Group home had one TV and a pile of broken radios. You learn quick. Nora watched him, arms crossed loosely. Something passed between them in the silence, not admiration. Exactly, more like recognition. Two people who had spent years making do with less, but had chosen different ways to survive it. At break time, Nora sat near the side window with a view of the elementary school across the street. Her daughter napped in her lap, head tucked beneath her chin. Emmett sat across from her, fiddling with a pen. He died in 2013, she said quietly. Emmett looked up. My husband, U.S. Marines. He was in Afghanistan when a convoy got hit. We were 3 days away from his homecoming leave. Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't telling it for sympathy. She spoke like someone reciting a fact she'd filed away long ago. Tyler was 5. He still talks to his dad's picture. Every time he's scared. A pause. I didn't fix that bike to be a hero. She continued. I did it because his father would have, and because no kid should feel like help has conditions. Emmett didn't interrupt. He only nodded, once. Then slowly, something in his expression shifted. I think I saw his name, he said, in a request file, years ago. My company used to manage emergency grants for military families. There was one case we couldn't approve it. Missing verification. Just one missing document. Nora said nothing, but the silence thickened. One delay, Emmett whispered. One piece of paper. She let that sit for a moment, then said, simply, doesn't matter now. You didn't know, and I don't need you to feel bad. But the look in his eyes said he already did. It wasn't guilt, it was something older, something quieter. The ache of realizing you'd been close to doing good, and missed it. He looked at her then, not with apology, but with something steadier. You don't need saving, he said, but has anyone ever really stood beside you? Her hands tightened slightly on her daughter's blanket. She didn't answer. Outside, a car horn honked in the distance. A group of kids ran past the front window, laughing. Life moved. Then Emmett reached into his coat pocket again, pulled out a small folded paper, and placed it on the table. We want to help you build something, he said. A place of your own. A bike workshop for kids. Free, safe, real. Nora looked at the paper, then back at him. She didn't move, didn't speak, but she didn't say no. The light from the window caught just enough of her face to show a flicker of something behind her eyes. Not hope, not yet. Just the space where it might return. The old warehouse sat at the bend of the Allegheny River, like a forgotten shoulder of the city, dusty, rust-rimmed, and leaning gently from years of weather and time. A faded sign still clung to the metal above the entrance, Pittsburgh Rail and Trolley Repair. Below it, rust had bled through the paint, and ivy crept between cracked windows, but the bones held firm. Emmett unlocked the padlock with a slow turn. The hinges groaned when the door rolled open, scattering pigeons into the high beams. Light filtered in through shattered panels, casting long geometric shadows across the floor. It smelled of oil, old rubber, and something that reminded Nora of her father's garage, a mix of hard work and silence. She stepped inside slowly, boots crunching over glass and loose bolts. Her eyes lifted to the high ceiling, then to the steel arches that ran the length of the space. It looks like me, she murmured. Emmett glanced over. She kept walking, gutted in a few places, but still standing. It was the first time she had said something like that out loud. Not about a building, about herself. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then he nodded. That's why I brought you here. The next hours passed without speeches or plans. Just action. They rolled out tarps, swept corners, hauled broken furniture into a pile by the far door. Nora found an old workbench beneath a tarp, legs still sturdy, surface scratched with initials carved decades ago. She cleaned it with slow, methodical strokes, like she was coaxing memory back to life. Emmett uncovered an old pegboard of tools, most rusted beyond use, but a few pliers, an adjustable wrench still held their shape. Some of these could talk, he said, holding one up to the light. Nora smiled for the first time in days. It wasn't wide, but it reached her eyes. By late afternoon, they had cleared a wide rectangle in the middle of the space. Dust swirled in the golden light. Nora dipped a brush into a can of white paint and began tracing letters on a board they'd propped on 2 cinder blocks. Revival riders, she said as she painted, her strokes careful, steady. Everyone deserves a second ride. Emmett read the words as they formed, then leaned in and underlined revival with the edge of his sleeve, accidentally swiping a streak of paint across her cheek. She blinked, caught off guard. He froze. Sorry. But she didn't reach to wipe it. Instead, she raised one eyebrow and, without a word, dipped her finger in the paint tray and flicked a speck onto his collar. For the first time, they both laughed. Not the polite kind, not the nervous kind, the kind that filled the open space with something weightless. Just then, the warehouse door creaked open again. A group of children, 3 boys and 1 girl, no older than 10, stood just beyond the threshold, dirt on their jeans, curiosity in their eyes. Hey, one of them said, peeking in, is this a shop or something? Nora put the brush down and walked toward them. It's gonna be, she said. You want to learn how to take apart a bike? The tallest boy nodded slowly. We don't got bikes. Well, Nora replied, stepping aside, we've got a lot of wheels and not enough hands. You don't mind getting messy? You're welcome here. They entered shyly, eyes wide, feet light. She handed one of them a rag and showed him how to polish a handlebar. Another started sweeping. Emmett watched from a distance. It didn't look like a business yet, not even a class, but something had begun, and no one was standing outside the door anymore. Just as the day was turning, footsteps echoed from the sidewalk. A man in a tailored gray coat and polished shoes approached, a clipboard tucked beneath his arm. He stopped at the threshold, eyes scanning the children, the half-painted sign, the scattered parts on the floor. I'm from the Department of Buildings, he said, flatly. You're operating a teaching facility in a non-permitted structure. Nora wiped her hands on her jeans and walked to him. We're cleaning up, just getting started. He pointed at the painted board. You're calling it Revival Riders. You intend to instruct minors here, that's the hope. He pulled a pen from his jacket. Then I'll need to see your permit. Today, if possible. Behind her, the children froze. One held a wrench midair. Emmett stepped forward, silent but steady. Nora didn't move. She stood still, breathing evenly, facing the man in the coat. But in her mind, she was already counting what came next. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The community hall of Fulton Springs had never felt quite as cold as it did that night, even though the heating units clicked steadily in the corners. It wasn't the temperature, it was the eyes. 100 of them, maybe more, seated in fold-out chairs facing the makeshift podium. Some smiled as Nora stepped up. Some didn't blink. A few looked down like they weren't sure why they came. The banner behind her read, Neighborhood Futures, Open Forum. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and cheap disinfectant. A microphone on a stand buzzed with low static. Nora stepped to it and cleared her throat. Her voice wasn't trained for public speaking, but she didn't stumble. My name's Nora Callahan. I used to teach reading at the elementary school up the block. I lost that job because I fixed a bike for a kid who needed to get home. There were no gasps. Everyone already knew. It had been shared 1,000 times online. She kept going. A week ago, With the help of some people who believe in second chances, we started turning an old trolley station into something new, a place where kids can learn to fix things. Bikes, yes, but also confidence, skills, maybe even their sense of worth. Someone coughed near the front. I didn't come here to ask for permission, she said, but I came to let you know we're not going anywhere. A pause. Then from the back, a man raised his hand, not for a question, just to speak. My daughter goes to that school. She told me about what you did. Thank you. Another voice followed, quieter. It's a great idea. Just, is it safe? These things, sometimes they start strong and fade. A third voice. Where's the funding coming from? Who's really behind it? Nora's grip on the podium tightened slightly. She looked down at her notes but didn't read them. She looked up again instead. I get it, she said. I know what it's like to be let down. I've been on both sides. All I can promise is we show up. We fix what we can. And when it breaks again, we'll be there too. When she stepped back from the mic, there was no applause, just quiet, heavy, curious, unsettled. Later that night, she sat alone at the back of the trolley station, now partly cleared of debris, her coat pulled tight around her. Her daughter was asleep on a sleeping bag upstairs. The sign was still half painted. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Emmett. They're pulling me back. Board meeting. One of them called it emotional mismanagement. Friday. I need you there. Not as a symbol. As a partner. She read it 3 times. He was back in New York now, back in that tall building with long conference tables and people who wore suits like armor. People who measured impact in percentages and risk in spreadsheets. People who never walked through broken doors to help tie a child's shoe. She stared at the message for a long while. Then she typed, "Why me?" 3 dots appeared, then stopped, then started again. Finally. Because when you speak, people listen differently. They don't hear a pitch. They hear something real. I don't want to walk in alone. Not this time. She set the phone down. She didn't reply. Not yet. But she didn't turn it off either. Outside, the city moved on quiet cars passing, a dog barking in the distance. She looked up through the skylight, cracked but open, where stars blinked through the night like uncertain eyes, trying to understand something big and quiet and still forming. She didn't look back, but somewhere inside, something had started to lean forward. The Carrington building stood tall and cold above Fifth Avenue, its glass exterior reflecting the morning clouds like a shield. Nora paused at the revolving doors, adjusting her coat, the same one she'd worn every winter for the past 4 years. She glanced at her shoes, their soles worn nearly flat, and stepped inside anyway. The marble lobby gleamed. Polished shoes clicked against the floor. Men in tailored suits walked past without looking. Women in heels and structured coats seemed to glide rather than walk. She didn't belong here, not by their measure, but she wasn't here to be measured. Security checked her ID, hesitated, then waved her through after confirming her name. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, not because of the time, but because of the quiet, the kind that settles between walls you weren't meant to touch. On the 41st floor, the doors opened to a boardroom already filled. Glass walls let sunlight flood the space, but the air inside was dense with opinion. Around a long oval table sat 12 members of the Carrington Board, men and women of power, legacy, and Polish. At the head, Emmett sat still, not slouched, not stiff, just steady. Nora entered from the side, as agreed, no announcement, no introduction. She stood quietly near the far wall, hands clasped in front of her, letting the conversation unfold. "We've reviewed your discretionary disbursements. Mr. Carrington," said a woman with silver hair and a pinched expression. "Revival Riders is not an approved line item." Another added, "There's no tax shelter, no projected return. It's an emotional project." Emmett nodded slowly. "Yes, it is." That stirred a murmur. Then one of the younger board members, a man with rimless glasses and an unreadable face, gestured toward Nora. "And she is..." Emmett didn't hesitate. She's the reason I remembered who I used to be. The room went quiet. Eyes turned to Nora. She didn't fidget. Instead, she stepped forward and reached into her satchel. From it, she pulled a sheet of paper creased, a little smudged at the edges. This, she said, laying it gently on the polished table, was drawn by a boy named Tyler, 8 years old. His dad died overseas, and no one ever told him why the government said no to the benefits his family should have received. He rides an old bike that barely works, but he drew it with wings. Some leaned closer. The drawing showed a shaky outline of a bicycle with exaggerated angel wings, rising into a sky of stick-figure stars. Nora looked up. He doesn't know what Carrington Holdings is. He doesn't care. He only knows someone kept a promise his father made before he died. No one spoke. Then from the far end of the table, a voice older, low, broke the silence. "I recognize her," said a man with a folded copy of a file in front of him. "She filed a claim against us 6 years ago, after her husband's death, denied on technical grounds." All heads turned back to Nora. She didn't flinch. "I filed because we needed help. We were told paperwork was missing. It was. But not from our end." The woman with silver hair narrowed her eyes. "And now you're working with us. Forgive me, but this feels like narrative convenience." Nora met her gaze. This isn't a story. It's a second chance. For a boy. For a place. Maybe even for your company. Emmett's voice cut in, low but firm. "She didn't ask to be here. I did. And if that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you've grown too comfortable in rooms without voices like hers." The room tensed. Outside the window, the city buzzed on, unaware of the small earthquake happening inside that conference room. Nora turned to leave, then paused. She looked over her shoulder. "Tyler doesn't need your names or your titles, but he'll remember that someone showed up. Maybe that's enough." She walked toward the elevator, behind her. Whispers rose like a tide, but she didn't turn around. She kept moving forward, straight-backed, quiet, certain. She didn't look back. But someone in that room suddenly wished he had. The word Carrington landed like a stone in water, the ripples pushing through every corner of the room. Nora felt it hit her chest first, then her hands, which instinctively tightened around the edges of the little boy's drawing she'd just placed on the table. Her jaw set. The voices around her blurred, muffled, as if she'd been pulled underwater. Emmett leaned forward, eyes searching the faces in the room. "What did you say?" A woman 2 seats down from the chairman tapped a manila folder resting beside her. "Carrington Foundation, Widow Benefits Claim, 2017. Filed by a Nora Callahan after her husband's death in Iraq. Denied due to incomplete documentation. Signed by Harold Carrington." Someone whispered, "That's your father." "Right." The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Nora didn't move. Her face stayed composed, but something in her posture changed, like a door shutting softly from the inside. Emmett's voice cracked, barely above a breath. I've never seen that file." Nora finally looked at him. No anger in her eyes, just stillness. "You don't have to explain," she said, her tone quiet and sharp, like cold wind against skin. "You weren't supposed to see it. That's the point of people like your father. They made sure people like me never got far enough to speak." Emmett stood as she gathered the drawing. "Nora, wait, I didn't know." She turned slowly, meeting his eyes again. "That letter came 4 weeks after the funeral. It said my daughter and I didn't qualify because a signature from the commanding officer was missing. He died with my husband, but there was no place to explain that in the form." Silence hung. A few board members looked away. Others pretended to shuffle papers. "I don't need pity," she said. "I need the next mother like me not to spend 2 years choosing between groceries and heating because some accountant thought her loss wasn't tidy enough. She didn't wait for permission." Nora turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps deliberate across the thick carpet. Emmett followed, past the reception, down the hallway lined with plaques and photos of pasteboard chairs, down to the sleek elevator lobby. He caught up just as the button lit up. Nora, he said, breath uneven. I didn't approve that. I wasn't even part of the foundation yet. But I promise you, if I had known she faced him, you didn't. And maybe that's the whole problem. Good men like you keep showing up late. The elevator pinged. The doors opened. Emmett stepped back. You once asked me if anyone ever stood on my side, she said, her voice steady. You're trying to now. But you still carry a name that made sure I stood alone for too long. The doors began to close. She didn't blink. I can forgive, but I won't rebuild with someone who still has one foot in the house that locked me out. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. The doors shut. He stood there, eyes fixed on the faint reflection of himself in the brushed steel. No words, no motion, just the echo of a truth he hadn't lived, but now had to carry. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. Back in Pittsburgh, the days blurred into each other. Nora filled each hour with motion, sweeping the warehouse floor, retightening bolts on donated bikes, teaching the kids how to sand down rust without scraping skin. Revival riders opened every morning as usual. The kids still came. Their voices still echoed under the high beams. But Nora didn't laugh as often now. She worked with her head down, her smile polite, her mind elsewhere. She hadn't answered Emmett's messages. There weren't many. Just 2. One said he was sorry. The other, that he'd respect her silence. The air had turned cold again. Autumn slipped toward winter, one Tuesday evening, as she was locking up the side gate. A woman she barely recognized approached, middle-aged, soft coat, anxious smile. Ms. Callahan, she asked gently. Nora nodded. The woman held out a white envelope. A man left this at my house. Said you were my son's teacher years ago. He didn't give a name. Just said it was to repay what his father once denied. Nora hesitated, took the envelope, and watched the woman leave without waiting for thanks. Inside, there was no check. Just 3 papers. A scanned receipt from the Carrington Foundation. A deposit confirmation, $60,000 marked for the Staff Sergeant Paul Callahan Scholarship Fund. And a note, handwritten, in familiar lean script. I cannot change what was lost. But I can start by listening to what still speaks. No signature, just a date. Nora sat down on the concrete step outside the warehouse, hands trembling. She read the note again, then looked up at the street lamp flickering above the sidewalk, throwing thin shadows against the brick wall. She didn't cry right away. She held the envelope in her lap and stared at the letterhead, the clean lettering of the Carrington name beside her husband's. For the first time, they stood on the same page. The warehouse was quiet inside, just the scent of grease, old wood, and something else now, hope. Maybe. She stepped back into the building, turned on a single light, and walked slowly toward the photo of Paul she kept on her desk. It was worn from years of being tucked away him in uniform, young and grinning like he knew she'd always be watching. She placed her hand gently on the frame. You see, she whispered, someone's trying to fix it. The light flickered. A distant siren passed outside. Somewhere in the background, a wind chime rattled softly. Then a voice rang out behind her, clear, breathless. Mom, you gotta see this. Her daughter, Marley, burst through the back door, waving the remote. What is it? Nora asked, startled. Marley hit play on the small TV in the corner. A local news anchor appeared. Behind her, the warehouse a shot from across the river, its freshly painted sign visible even in the fading light. The headline read, From Grief to Grit, the woman who built a place for everyone. The screen cut to footage of Nora helping a boy fix a flat tire. The camera zoomed in on her hands guiding his, gentle but firm. Her voice, though faint, was clear. If it matters to you, you fix it. Doesn't have to be perfect. Just has to move forward. Marley looked up, beaming. You're on TV. You look like someone who owns the whole world. Nora sat back in the chair and watched herself move on the screen slower, more tired, but still standing, still showing up. The words at the bottom of the screen shifted again. A community stitched by second chances. One woman's promise becomes a movement. She didn't look away, but in her chest, something shifted like a thread pulled gently, starting to come undone. It had been a full week since the news story aired, since the letter arrived, since the silence between them stretched into something more fragile than distance, something waiting for one of them to breathe first. That morning. Nora buttoned her coat slowly. Marley adjusted the collar for her, then placed the small drawing of the winged bicycle into her hand. "You don't need to be like them." "Mom," she said quietly, "they need to be like you." The auditorium at the Pittsburgh District Education Center was wider than it was tall, but it still felt cavernous when she stepped inside. Rows of principals, program officers, city planners, all with laptops glowing on their laps and pens tapping against pads. Nora moved to the podium. No slides, no notes, just her voice and the folded paper in her coat pocket. "I don't have a business degree," she began. "No foundation backing, no corporate partner waiting in the wings. What I have is a pair of hands, a child who trusted me, and a promise I made out loud so I couldn't take it back." A few murmurs rippled across the audience. She kept going, her voice steadier than she expected. "We didn't build Revival Riders to save anyone. We built it so these kids could save themselves, one bolt at a time. One morning they decided to show up instead of disappear." She paused, then added, "Sometimes that's all they need to be seen as worth showing up for." About halfway through, a woman in a charcoal suit raised her hand. "This is inspiring, Ms. Callahan, but if the district were to consider adopting any model similar to yours, we'd need proof of long-term viability. What's your financial model? Who's advising your structure?" Nora opened her mouth, but another voice answered first. "I am." All heads turned. From the back row, Emmett Carrington stood. His tie was crooked, jacket draped over his arm, like he'd come straight from somewhere unimportant or somewhere that had stopped mattering. "I'm not on any board," he said. "I'm not speaking for a company. I'm just the guy who makes sure the lights stay on. And I'm not doing it to fix something. I'm doing it because she reminds me of what leadership used to mean." The room went quiet. She has what most of us forgot: the courage to lead without needing power. Nora didn't move. She just watched him. His face wasn't pleading. It was steady, almost peaceful, like he had finally accepted the cost of what he couldn't undo and chose to stay anyway. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of his name hovering between them, not as debt, not as history, just as a fact, like the cold, like the floor beneath her feet. When the applause came, it was soft, cautious, but real. She finished without theatrics, no ending quote, no sweeping pitch, just a promise. "I don't know how far we'll go. But if you're waiting for something perfect before you help, it's already too late. Later." As the room cleared out, Emmett waited near the exit. He didn't step forward until she did. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. He simply reached into his coat and held something out. Worn leather, cracked at the seams. A pair of child-sized gloves. She took them. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. She looked down at the gloves, turned them over, then met his eyes. Not with forgiveness, not yet. But with something gentler, something closer. She slipped the gloves into her coat pocket. They walked out together, no more than a step apart. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the sharp scent of oil and sun-warmed rubber. Revival Riders pulsed with the kind of noise that didn't ask for permission: laughter, music from a dusty speaker, the occasional clang of dropped tools. It wasn't polished, but it was alive. Nora stood on a makeshift wooden pallet, holding a clipboard she didn't really need. She wasn't reading names. She was counting glances, nods. How many of the kids had shown up not because they were told, but because they wanted to be here, to belong. More than 30 kids had gathered, most of them dragging along parents or siblings. Some were still hesitant, hovering by the food table. Others jumped right into it, helping repaint the back wall, fixing training wheels, learning how to patch a tire tube. Emmett moved through it all with his sleeves rolled up, a wrench in one hand, a rag in the other. No title, no distance. Just another adult in the circle, kneeling beside a boy who couldn't get the chain to sit right. Nora watched him for a moment, then turned back to the small girl tugging her sleeve. Miss Nora. She knelt to eye level. Yes, sweetheart. The girl handed her a folded piece of yellow paper. Crayons had dented the lines deep. It smelled faintly of glue. Nora opened it. Inside, scrawled in uneven handwriting, was one sentence: I don't have a daddy, but you make me feel enough. She looked at the girl, who shrugged and said, I just wanted you to know. Nora blinked once, slowly, then again. She didn't cry. Instead, she gently tucked the card into the inside pocket of her jacket, like something fragile. She stood back up, heart quieter, but full. By midday, several teachers from nearby districts had arrived. Some had heard about the program through news coverage. Others were friends of friends, educators chasing something that still felt real. One teacher approached her, a tall woman in a green windbreaker, paint on her fingers. Miss Callahan, would you be open to helping us model something like this in our school? We've got space. We just need a starting point. Nora looked around. A 12-year-old was showing a kindergartner how to tighten a bolt. An older man was laughing with a kid who had once been suspended 3 times in 2 months. And on the back fence, someone had started outlining the shape of a bicycle with wings. She didn't have to say yes, but she didn't have to think long, either. We'll help, she said. This wasn't meant to stay just here anyway. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was cleaning up after something broken. She felt like she was building towards something whole, later. When the crowd had thinned and the sun dipped behind the row houses, she found Emmett standing by the wall behind the garage. The children had finished the mural, a bright, simple bike, 2 wide, cartoonish wings. Underneath, in blue spray paint letters, it read, Kindness has wheels. She stood beside him, arms crossed, the light catching the side of her face. Emmett didn't say anything. He just kept looking at the wall. After a long minute, she asked, Did you ever think it had come to this? No, he answered, but I hoped it might. She glanced at him. You really think we can scale this? He didn't smile, but his voice softened. I think some things aren't meant to scale. They're meant to ripple, from inside. They heard kids laughing over the last bike race of the day. Nora looked out over the lot, hands in her jacket, then back to the mural. She didn't look back. But he knew. Something had changed. It was almost noon, but the air still held the soft chill of early spring, the kind that made you keep your sleeves down, even when the sun found your face. Revival Riders was louder than usual, saws buzzing, children laughing, buckets clattering against the concrete floor. Nora stood at the front of the lot, showing a group of high schoolers how to adjust a brake cable. She had grease on her wrist and a line of sweat just beginning to form at her neck. Behind her, Emmett was organizing tools on a folding table, placing wrenches into old plastic crates labeled in permanent marker. Tyler had been following him around for the past half hour, chattering about gear shifts and his favorite superhero. Then it happened so quick, so light, it might have slipped past another moment. Dad, come look what I did. The word landed in the center of the courtyard, like a stone in still water. Everything stopped. The scraping, the hammering, the laughter. Tyler stood frozen, his face reddening the instant the words left his mouth. Nora turned, eyes finding her son. Then Emmett, who blinked slowly as if he hadn't quite heard right. Emmett knelt. His voice was quiet, gentle. What did you call me? Kiddo Tyler hesitated, shoulders rising toward his ears. I didn't mean to. He looked away, embarrassed, then back up at Emmett with wide, uncertain eyes. Emmett didn't laugh. He didn't correct him. He just nodded, slowly. Okay, around them. The courtyard stayed still. Nobody teased. Nobody filled the space with small talk. Something real had slipped through. Something raw and too honest to dress up. Nora felt it hit her like a quiet wave, unexpected and undeniable. After a few moments, the sound returned. A wrench clanged somewhere near the workbench. The wind pushed a tarp against the fence. Tyler, not waiting for permission, ran off to join a group painting wooden crates. Nora sat down on the concrete steps near the back entrance. Emmett joined her, brushing sawdust off his jeans before sitting. For a while, they said nothing. She didn't look at him, just picked at a peeling spot of paint on the step. Then, without turning, she said, "I don't know when I started trusting you, but I did. Somewhere in the middle of all this." He didn't answer right away, just nodded once. That was enough. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't romantic. It was something more durable, like a shared language built out of long days, held silences, and doing things that mattered. They sat there as kids zipped past, a blur of color and voice and energy. Revival Riders felt different today, not like a project anymore, more like a place that could hold people the way they were. Then Nora's phone buzzed. She checked the screen, hesitated, then answered. "Yes, this is Nora Callahan." A woman's voice on the other end was crisp, practiced. "Ms. Callahan, I'm calling from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. We're pleased to inform you that you've been selected as the recipient of this year's Community Contribution Award." Nora blinked, unsure how to respond. "We'd like you to join us at the ceremony in Harrisburg next month. We'd also like you to prepare a short speech. Would that be possible?" She looked out at the kids. Tyler was laughing now, balancing on a wobbling tire rim. A teacher from another district was jotting notes near the whiteboard. Emmett had stood back up, helping a girl steady her bike seat. "Yes," she said finally, voice steady. "Yes, I'll be there." She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her pocket. Then she looked up at the mural again, the one with the winged bike, the one that hadn't been part of any plan. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. It started with a headline. "Wall Street heir turns his back on power for Pittsburgh's kids." From there, the story spread fast. By noon, it was on the evening news. By evening, it had made its way to every corner of Carrington's glass tower in Manhattan. They didn't like it. A photo of Emmett standing beside Nora, holding a wrench instead of a briefcase, had run above the fold in the Pittsburgh Gazette. The caption read, "Revival Riders, built with bare hands." The article called it a blueprint for urban renewal. But to Carrington's board of directors, it read more like insubordination. By the time Emmett entered the executive conference room, the temperature had dropped below corporate cordiality. The oldest board member, a man with more medals than expressions, closed the door behind him and went straight to the point. "You're being watched, Emmett. The market sees you as distracted. You either step up as CEO or step down as a man with a hobby." Emmett didn't answer right away. His mind wasn't in Manhattan. It was still on the cracked cement floor of Revival Riders, where a child had handed him a drawing of a bike with wings and signed it, "To Mr. E." That night, Nora called. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She didn't ask if he was okay. She knew he wasn't. "You don't owe me anything, Emmett," she said. "And I don't want to be the reason you give up your name, your legacy, whatever that means to the world." He sat on the edge of his hotel bed, elbows on his knees. "I'm not giving it up. I'm just not letting it define me anymore." A pause. Then softer, "I just want to be someone who doesn't walk away." Nora didn't reply for a while. Then she said, "Just be someone who doesn't need to be rescued or praised. Just show up. That's all we ever ask of each other." The call ended, but the weight of her voice lingered longer than any boardroom verdict. The next morning, the board assembled again. Emmett arrived early. He was the only one not wearing a tie. He stood at the end of the long polished table, rested his hands on the wood, and looked each member in the eye. "My father built Carrington with contracts and equity. My mother built me with a lunchbox and a folding chair at community council meetings. You talk about legacy, well, that's mine." He slid a document across the table. "I'm resigning from my executive post, effective immediately." Mouths opened, none spoke. "I'm allocating all my Class A shares into a community trust. It'll be called the Rosa Carrington Fund. Its sole purpose to support education, equity, and restorative projects across underserved neighborhoods. And no, it won't have a tax shield. A woman at the far end whispered, "You're burning it all down." "No," Emmett said quietly. "I'm planting something new. I just won't be around to water it the way you want." He picked up his coat, paused. "I was born into this tower, but I'm not dying here." He left before they could vote, speak, or rewrite the narrative. Back in Pittsburgh, Nora stood in front of the mural again. The kids had added new details, tiny handprints under the tires, small signatures inside the wings. The words still shimmered in blue paint. "Kindness has wheels." Her phone buzzed. It was a message. No name, just a photo Emmett, standing on a sidewalk in Brooklyn, holding a rusted bike with a sign that said, "Free to fix, free to ride." She stared at the image for a long time. Then she whispered, mostly to herself, "He didn't choose me. He chose us." A year had passed, and yet, in the way the light hit the mural, in the soft sound of laughter echoing from the back of the shop, Revival Riders still felt like it was just beginning. They had grown. Not in size, though they had added 2 new rooms and a rainproof awning, but in purpose. What had started with a handful of tools in a single dusty warehouse had now inspired 6 public schools to integrate hands-on mechanical training into their curriculum. Over 1,200 bikes had been restored, each handed to a child who had never owned one. And still, every Saturday morning, the same old door creaked open, letting in new feet and old hopes. Nora stood just outside the back entrance that afternoon, watching 2 teenagers finish repainting the fence. She didn't say much. She rarely had to. Her presence was enough firm, quiet, consistent. That was how real change took root, not through speeches, but through staying. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, an official letter from the State Department of Education. They would be honoring her with the Community Impact Award at the Harrisburg Community Theater, the kind of event where people wore navy blue suits and clapped on cue. She hadn't wanted to go. It was Tyler who convinced her. "They're not giving it to you," he'd said. "They're giving it to all of us. You just have to go pick it up." So, she packed her best shoes, the same ones she wore to her husband's memorial. She had never worn them again until that night, inside the Harrisburg Community Theater. Warm lights bathed the wooden floor, casting long shadows that made the hall feel more intimate than grand. Families, teachers, students all gathered, all looking forward. And somewhere near the back, standing beneath a balcony light, was Emmett. He wore no tie, just a soft gray blazer and eyes that followed her every move, like they had something to say but didn't need to say it. When her name was called, the applause was gentle at first, then built, wave after wave, until the whole room stood. Nora walked slowly to the stage. She had a folded sheet in her hand, a speech written and rewritten. But when she reached the microphone, she didn't open it. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces, the hands, the breath held, and said, "I once lost my job for fixing a bike for a student. Tonight, I'm standing here because kids like him reminded me kindness isn't a luxury. It's the bare minimum." The room fell still. Then came the standing ovation, not for her words, but for everything behind them. Flashes flickered, phones rose, cameras zoomed, but Nora's eyes went only to one place. Tyler sat in the middle row, grinning wide, waving like a boy who finally saw his person on the big stage. She waved back, but her smile was softer, not for the audience, not for the stage, but for the boy who, somehow, still believed in things before they happened. From the back of the theater, Emmett didn't move. He only watched. The sound around him blurred. What he heard, instead, was a voice inside him, simple and certain. "I don't need her to choose me. I just want to be part of the world she's building." After the ceremony, Nora searched. She circled the lobby, looked behind the curtains, even asked someone near the valet line. He left just after the applause. Someone said, "Didn't even stay for the reception." By the time she got back to Revival Riders, the sun was dipping low. The lights inside the shop were off, but the door wasn't locked. Her footsteps echoed as she crossed the floor. Then she saw it. Emmett's car, parked by the side, engine cold. Inside, On the workbench, next to a half-assembled gear system, was a single note. No salutation, no signature, just the words I didn't leave. I just came home to where I belong. It was a Saturday in June, and the heat had not yet pressed down on the streets. The sun fell soft across the cracked pavement outside Revival Riders, catching the glint of old chrome and the chalk marks kids had scribbled near the steps. Inside, there was the smell of paint, oil, and something harder to name, something like hope, worn in, comfortable. Nora stood by the open garage bay, watching Tyler crouch beside a boy, half his age, showing him how to read the air gauge on a tire pump. His hands were steady, his voice quiet, not correcting, just guiding, nearby. Her daughter looped around with a roll of cloth towels, handing them out like little badges of purpose. She had that same stubborn gait her father had, like the ground would move if she needed it to. The mural along the back wall was finished now, wings on wheels, hands stretched outward from rooftops, a ribbon of color that bled into the ceiling. It hadn't been Nora's idea. The kids had drawn it themselves. She'd only held the ladder. A child tugged her sleeve. "Miss Nora, where's Mr. Emmett?" She turned and saw him. He was near the storage shelves, sleeves rolled, apron tied uneven. In one hand, he held a paint can. In the other, a cutout of a butterfly, which he was taping gently onto the basket of a bike with bent spokes. His head was bowed, expression calm, like this was exactly where he was always meant to be. No one said "I love you." No one needed to. Love wasn't a vow in that room. It was the silence that didn't feel empty, the glance that didn't need explanation, the presence that stayed. Nora watched him for a while, long enough for the question to pass. Then she wiped her hands on the side of her jeans, walked over, and without a word, picked up the wrench beside him. He didn't look at her, just shifted a little to give her room. In the far corner of the room, where old parts were sorted into mismatched bins, a girl, curious and patient, opened the wooden box they called the memory chest. It was where they kept the strange things, bent nameplates, forgotten notes, photos too smudged to hang. She pulled out a yellowed envelope. "Miss Nora," she called softly. Nora turned. The girl handed her the envelope, then ran back toward the bikes. She read the handwriting once, then opened it. The paper was creased, fragile, the ink faded in places, but the message was clear. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't come home. I don't know what the world looks like without me in it, but I know you. And I know you'll try to carry everything alone. Don't do something for someone else, some kid who doesn't have a name yet. Build something that doesn't need your name on it. You've always been stronger than you think." She stood there, the letter in her hands. Her fingers didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She smiled, folded the letter, tucked it into her back pocket, then tied the green bandana on her wrist a little tighter. The one her daughter said made her look like a superhero. She never argued. Outside, the clouds broke, letting a little more light through. She glanced at Emmett. He was now tightening a bolt, back bent, focused. One of the girls passed him a juice box. He took it with a nod, said thank you, and sipped like it was the best drink he'd had in years. She looked around at the scattered bikes, the scattered children, the scattered pieces of a life that had fallen apart and been rebuilt, not by miracles, but by consistency. They didn't all believe the same things. They didn't vote the same. They didn't even speak the same languages sometimes, but they looked in the same direction. And that, somehow, was enough. The wrench was still warm in her hand, the scent of oil lingering in the summer air. Around her, children's voices rose and fell like wind through leaves, messy, loud, alive. No speeches, no grand applause, just the sound of small things mending, in bikes, in people. Some stories don't need a spotlight to matter. They need someone who stays, long after the world stops watching. And maybe that's how you know you're home, not by where you are, but by who still believes in what you're building, even if it starts with just one bike.